All right. Oh, I have my retainer in. Oh, fuck. I can't read with my retainer still in? Okay. I'll just, put it on here. Okay. My teeth. My teeth. Man, my teeth. This is too thick of a coat. I'm gonna take it off. Okay. Alright. So the subject of today's vlog will be a little different from past ones. So I've been assigned as part of a school assignment, you know, those school assignments. I've been assigned to do a presentation on this one philosophy text. And you know, I've been lagging behind a few times in the school, and so I haven't been really up to date. And of course, it's the night before it's due. Night before my presentation's due. I haven't read my stuff at all. I'm a bit cooked, so to speak. And so yeah, I guess I'm just using my vlog format, or maybe my blog format, as a motivator to actually get this thing read. Okay. So what we're gonna read today is something called Discourse on the Origins and the Foundations of Inequality Among Mankind. Wonderful. Alright, let's get this. Oh, it's by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You know, very Frenchman. I like French people, so I had to choose him, but I'm a bit lagging behind, so oh well. Alright, stop wasting time. Let's get this done. It is of man I am to speak, and the question into which I am inquiring informs me that it is to men that I am going to speak. For to those alone who are not afraid of honoring truth, it belongs to propose discussions. What? For to those alone who are not afraid of honoring truth, it belongs to propose discussions of this kind. For to those alone who are not afraid of honoring truth, it belongs to propose discussions of this kind. Okay. I shall therefore defend with confidence the cause of mankind before the sages, who invite me to stand up in its defense, and I shall think myself happy if I can but behave in a manner not unworthy of my subject and of my judges. I fucking hate Rousseau now. God, why did I choose him? Alright, let's get this thing done. I conceive two species of inequality among men, one which I call natural or physical inequality, because it is established by nature and consists in the difference of age, health, bodily strength, and the qualities of the mind or of the soul. The other, which may be termed moral or political inequality, because it depends on a kind of convention and is established or at least authorized by the common consent of mankind. This species of inequality consists in the different privileges which some men enjoy to the prejudice of others, such as that of being richer, more honored, more powerful, and even that of exacting obedience from them. It were absurd to ask, what is the cause of natural inequality, seeing the bare definition of natural inequality answers the question. Okay. It would be more absurd still to inquire if there might not be some essential connection between the two species of inequality, as it would be asking, in other words, if those who command are necessarily better men than those who obey, and if strength of body or of mind, wisdom or virtue are always to be found in individuals, in the same proportions with power or riches. A question fit perhaps to be discussed by slaves in the hearing of their masters, but unbecoming, free and responsible beings in quest of truth. Yo, I did not understand that shit at all. It's gonna be a long blog, I can feel it. Okay, and let me just go through that again. Just that paragraph. It were absurd to ask, what is the cause of natural inequality, seeing the bare definition of natural inequality answers the question. It would be more absurd still to inquire if there might not be some essential connection between the two species of inequality, as would be asking, in other words, if those who command are necessarily better men than those who obey, and if strength of body or of mind, wisdom or virtue are always to be found in individuals in the same proportion with power or riches. A question fit perhaps to be discussed by slaves in the hearing of their masters, but unbecoming, free and reasonable beings in quest of truth. I assume it's but unbecoming of free and reasonable beings in quest of truth. Okay. What therefore is precisely the subject of this discourse. It is to point out in the progress of things that moment when, right taking place of violence, nature became subject to law, to unfold that chain of amazing events, in consequence of which the strong submitted to serve the weak, and the people to purchase imaginary ease at the expense of real happiness. The philosophers who have examined the foundations of society have all perceived the necessity of tracing it back to a state of nature, but not one of them has ever got there. Some of them have not scrupled to attribute to men in that state of the ideas of justice and injustice, without troubling themselves to prove that he really must have had such ideas, or even that such ideas were useful to him. Others have spoken of the natural right of every man to keep what belongs to him, without letting us know what they meant by the word belong. Others, without further ceremony ascribing to the strongest an authority over the weakest, have immediately brought government into being, without thinking of the time requisite for men to form any notion of the things signified by the words authority and government. All of them, in fine, constantly harping on wants, avidity, oppression, desires, and pride, have transferred to the state of nature ideas picked up in the bosom of society. In speaking of savages, they describe citizens. Nay, few of our own writers seem to have so much as doubted that a state of nature did once actually exist, though it plainly appears by sacred history that even the first man, immediately furnished as he was by God himself with both instructions and precepts, never lived in that state, and that if we give to the books of Moses that credit which every Christian philosopher ought to give them, we must deny that even before the deluge such a state ever existed among men, unless they fell into it by some extraordinary event, a paradox very difficult to maintain and altogether impossible to prove. Okay, that was pretty manageable. Let us begin, therefore, by laying aside facts, for they do not affect their question. The researches in which we may engage on this occasion are not to be taken for historical truths, but merely as hypothetical and conditional reasonings, fitter to illustrate the nature of things than to show the true of the world. Religion commands us to believe that men, having been drawn by God himself out of a state of nature, are unequal, because it is his pleasure that they should be so. But religion does not forbid us to draw conjectures solely from the nature of man, considered in itself, than from that of the beings which surround him, concerning the fate of mankind, had they been left to themselves. This is the question I am to answer, the question I propose to examine in the present discourse. As mankind in general has an interest in my subject, I shall endeavor to use a language suitable to all nations, or rather, forgetting the circumstances of time and place in order to think of nothing but the men I speak to, I shall suppose myself in the Lyceum of Athens, repeating the lessons of my masters before the Platos and the Xenocrates, of that famous seat of philosophy as my judges, and in presence of the whole human species as my audience. O man, of whatever country you are, whatever your opinions may be, attend to my words. Here is your history such as I think I have read it, not in books composed by your fellow men, for they are liars, but in the books of nature, which never lie. All that comes from her will be true, nor will there be anything false, but where I may happen, without intending it, to introduce something of my own. The times I am going to speak of are very remote. How much are you changed from what you once were? It was in the matter of life of your species that I am going to write, from the qualities which you have received, and which your education and your habits have succeeded in depraving, but could not destroy. There is, I feel, an age at which every individual would choose to stop, and you would look for the age at which, had you your wish, your species had stopped. Discontented with your present condition for reasons which threaten your unhappy posterity with still greater vexations, you will perhaps wish it were in your power to go back, and this sentiment ought to be considered a panegyric of your first ancestors, a criticism of your contemporaries, and a source of terror to those who may have the misfortune of coming after you. Okay. This is not the end. This is far from the end. First part. However important it may be in order to form a proper judgment of this natural state of man, to consider him from his origin, and to examine him, as it were, in the first embryo of the species, I shall not attempt to trace his organization through its successive developments. I shall not stop to examine in the animal system what he may have been in the beginning, in order to have become at last what he actually is. I shall not inquire whether, as Aristotle thinks, his extended nails were no better at first than crooked hair, and whether, walking upon all fours, his looks directed to the earth, and confined to a horizon of a few paces extent, did not once point out to the nature and limits of his ideas. I could only form vague and almost imaginary conjectures on this subject. Comparative anatomy has not as yet made sufficient progress, and the observations of natural philosophy are too uncertain to establish upon such foundations the basis of any solid reasoning. For this reason, without having recourse to the supernatural information with which we have been favored on this head, or paying any attention to the changes that must have happened in the internal as well as external conformation of man, in proportion as he applied his limbs to new purposes and took to new foods, I shall suppose his conformation to have always been what we now behold it, that he always walked on 2 feet, made the same use of his hands that we do of ours, extended his looks over the whole face of nature, and measured with his eyes the vast extent of the heavens. Does this man know the concept of a period? Just put a few more in, please. If I strip this being, thus constituted, of all the supernatural gifts which he may have received, and of all the artificial faculties which he could not have acquired but by slow degrees, if I consider him, in a word, such as he must have issued from the hands of nature, I see an animal less strong than some, and less agile than others, but upon the whole the most advantageously organized of any. I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak, and his thirst at the first brook. I see him laying himself down to sleep at the foot of the same tree that afforded him his meal, and there are all his wants completely supplied. The earth, left to its own natural fertility, and covered with immense woods that no hatchet ever disfigured, offers at every step food and shelter to every species of animals. Men, dispersed among them, observe and imitate their industry, and thus rise as high as the instinct of beasts. With this advantage, then, whereas every species of beast is confined to one peculiar instinct, man, who perhaps has not any that particularly belongs to him, man, who perhaps has not any that particularly belongs to him, appropriates to himself those of all other animals, and lives equally among most of the different foods, which they only divide among themselves, a circumstance which qualifies him to find his subsistence more easily than any of them. accustomed from their infancy to the inclemency of the weather and to the rigor of the different seasons, inured to fatigue and obliged to defend, naked and without arms, their life and their prey against the other wild inhabitants of the forest, or at least to avoid their fury by flight, men acquire a robust and almost unalterable constitution. The children bringing with them into the world the excellent constitution of their parents, and strengthening it by the same exercises that first produced it, attain by this means all the vigor that the human frame is capable of. Nature treats them exactly in the same manner that Sparta treated the children of her citizens. Those who come well formed into the world she renders strong and robust, and destroys all the rest. Differing in this respect from our societies, in which the state, by permitting children to become burdensome to their parents, murders them without distinction in the wombs of their mothers. The body being the only instrument that savage man is acquainted with, he employs it to different uses, of which ours, for want of practice, are incapable, and we may thank our industry for that loss of that strength and agility which necessity obliges him to acquire. Had he a hatchet, would his hand so easily snap off from an oak so stout a branch? Had he a sling, would he hurl a stone so great a distance? Had he a ladder, would he climb so nimbly up a tree? Had he a horse, would he run with such swiftness? Give civilized man but time to gather about him all his machines, and no doubt he will outmatch the savage. But if you have a mind to see a contest still more unequal, place them naked and unarmed, the one opposite to the other, and you will soon discover the advantage there is in perpetually having all our forces constantly at our disposal, in being constantly prepared against all events, and in always carrying ourselves, as it were, whole and entire about us. Hobbes would have it that man is naturally void of fear and intent only upon attacking and fighting. An illustrious philosopher thinks on the contrary, and Cumberland and Pufendorf likewise affirm it, that nothing is more timid than man in a state of nature, that he is always in a tremble, and ready to fly at the first motion he perceives, at the first noise that strikes his ears. This indeed may be very true in regards to objects with which he is not acquainted, and I make no doubt of his being terrified at every new sight that presents itself, whether he cannot distinguish the physical good or an evil which he may expect from it, nor compare his strength with the dangers he has to encounter, circumstances that seldom occur in a state of nature where all things proceed in so uniform a manner, and the face of the earth is not liable to those sudden and continual changes occasioned in it by the passions and inconstancies of men living in bodies. But savage man, living dispersed among other animals, and finding himself early under a necessity of measuring his strength with theirs, soon makes a comparison between both, and finding that he surpasses them more in address than they surpass him in strength, he learns not to be any longer in dread of them. Turn out a bear or a wolf against a sturdy, active, resolute savage, and this they all are, provided with stones and a good stick, and you will soon find that the danger is at least equal on both sides, and that after several trials of this kind, wild beasts who are not fond of attacking each other will not be very disposed to attack man, whom they have found every whit as wild as themselves. As to animals who have really more strength than man has address, he is in regard to them what other weaker species are, who find means to subsist notwithstanding. He has even this great advantage over such weaker species, that being equally fleet with them, and finding on every tree an almost inviolable asylum, and almost inviolable asylum, he is always at liberty to accept or refuse the encounter, to fight or to fly. Let us add that it appears that no animal naturally makes war on man, except in the case of self-defense or extreme hunger, nor ever expresses against him any of these violent antipathies, which seem to indicate that one species in it is intended by nature for the food of another. But there are other more formidable enemies, and against which man is not provided with the same means of defense. I mean natural infirmities, infancy, old age, and sickness of every kind, melancholy proofs of our weakness, whereof the two first are common to all animals, and the last chiefly attends man living in a state of society. It is even observable in her, wherever she goes, Oh, it is even observable with in regard to infancy, that the mother being able to carry her child about with her, wherever she goes, can perform the duty of a nurse with a great deal less trouble than the females of many other animals, who are obliged to be constantly going and coming with no small labor and fatigue, one way to look out for their own subsistence, and another to suckle and feed their young ones. True it is that, if the woman happens to perish, her child is exposed to the greatest danger of perishing with her. But this danger is common to 100 other species, whose young ones require a great deal of time to be able to provide for themselves. And if our infancy is longer than theirs, our life is longer likewise, so that, in this respect too, all things are in a manner equal. Not but that there are other rules concerning the duration of the first age of life, and the number of the young of man or other animals, but they do not belong into my subject. With old men who stir and perspire but little, the demand for food diminishes where their abilities to provide it. And as a savage life would exempt them from the gout and the rheumatism and old ages of all ills that which human assistance is at least capable of alleviating, they would at least go off without its being perceived by others that they cease to exist, and almost without perceiving it themselves. God. Okay. In regards to sickness, I shall not repeat the vain and false declamations made use of to discredit medicine by most men, while they enjoy their health. I shall only ask if there are any solid observations from which we may conclude that in these countries where the healing art is most neglected, the mean duration of man's life is shorter than those where it is most cultivated. And how is it possible that this should be the case if we inflict more diseases upon ourselves than medicine can supply with remedies? The extreme inequalities in the matter of living of the several classes of mankind, the excess of idleness in some, and of labor in others, the facility of irritating and satisfying our sensuality and our appetites, this too, the too exquisite and out of the way foods of the rich, which fill them with fiery juices, and bring on indigestions, the unwholesome food of the poor, of which even bad as it is, they very often fall short, and the want of which tempts them, every opportunity that offers, to eat greedily and overflow their stomachs, late nights, excesses of every kind, immoderate transports of all the passions, fatigues, mental exhaustion, in a word, the numberless pains and anxieties annexed to every condition, and which the mind of man is constantly a prey to. These are the fatal proofs that most of our ills of our own making, and that we might have avoided them all by adhering to the simple, uniform, and solitary way of life prescribed to us by nature. Allowing that nature intended, we should always enjoy good health. I dare almost affirm that a state of reflection is a state against nature, and that the man who mediates is a degenerate animal. We need only call to mind the good constitution of savages, of those at least whom we have not destroyed by our strong liquors. We need only reflect that they are strangers to almost every disease, except those occasioned by wounds and old age, to be in a manner convinced that the history of human diseases might be easily written by pursuing that of civil societies. Such at least was the opinion of Plato, who concluded from certain remedies made use of or approved by Podalirius and Machaon at the siege of Troy, that several disorders, which these remedies were found to bring on in his days, were not known among men in that remote period. And Celsus relates that dieting, so necessary nowadays, was first invented by Hippocrates. Man, therefore, in a state of nature where there are so few sources of sickness, can have no great occasion for physic and less for physicians. Neither is the human species more to be pitied in this respect than any other species of animals. Ask those who make hunting their recreation or business, if in their excursions they meet with many sick or feeble animals. They meet with many carrying the marks of considerable wounds that have been perfectly well healed and closed up, with many whose bones formerly broken, and whose limbs almost torn off, have completely knit and untied. Oh, united, sorry, without any other surgeon but time, any other regimen but their usual way of living, and whose cures were not the less perfect for their not having been tortured with incisions, poisoned with drugs, or worn out by fasting. In a word, however, useful medicine, u- useful medicine well administered may be to us who live in a state of society. It is still passed out. Oh wait. In a word, however useful medicine well administered may be to us who live in a state of society, it is still passed out. It is still passed out that if, on the one hand, the sick savage, destitute of help, has nothing to hope for except from nature, on the other, he has nothing to fear but from its ills, a circumstance which often renders his situation preferable to ours. Preferable. God. Okay. This is hell. Okay. Let us therefore beware of confusing savage man with the men with whom we associate. Nature behaves towards all animals left to her care with a predilection that seems to prove how jealous she is of that prerogative. The horse, the cat, the bull, nay, the butt itself, have generally a higher stature, and always a more robust constitution, more vigor, more strength and courage in their forests than in our homes. They lose half of these advantages by becoming domestic animals. It looks as if all of our attention to treat them kindly and to feed them well serve only to bastardize them. It is thus with man himself. In proportion as he becomes sociable and a slave to others, he becomes weak, fearful, mean-spirited, and his soft and effeminate way of living at once completes the enervation of his strength and of his courage. We may add that there must be still a wider difference between man and man is in a savage and domestic condition than between beast and beast. For as men and beast have been treated alike by nature, all the comforts with which men indulge themselves, still more than they do the beasts tamed by them, are so many particular causes which make them degenerate more markedly. Nakedness, therefore, the want of houses, and of all these superfluities, which we considered as so very necessary, are not such mighty evils in respect to those primitive men, and much less still any obstacle to their preservation. Their skin, it is true, is destitute of hair, but then they have no occasion for any such covering in warm climates, and in cold climates they soon learn to apply to that use animals those of the animals they have conquered. They have only 2 feet to run with, but they have 2 hands to defend themselves with, and provide for all their wants. Their children, perhaps, learn to walk later and with difficulty, but their mothers carry them with ease, an advantage not granted to other species of animals, with whom the mother, when pursued, is obliged to abandon her young ones, or regulate her steps by theirs. In short, unless we admit those singular and fortuitous circumstances, or singular and fortuitous concurrences of circumstances, which I shall speak of hereafter, and which it is very possible may never have existed, it is evident, in any case, that the man who first made himself clothes and built himself a cabin supplied himself with things which he did not much need, since he had lived without them till then. And why should he not have been able to support, in his riper years, the same kind of life which he had supported from his infancy? Alone, idle, and always surrounded by danger, savage man must be fond of sleep, and sleep lightly like other animals, who think but little, and may, in a matter, be said to sleep all the time they do not think. Self-preservation being almost his only concern, he must exercise these faculties, most which are He must exercise those faculties which are most serviceable in attacking and defending, whether to subdue his prey or to prevent his becoming that of other animals. Those organs, on the contrary, which softness and sensuality can alone improve, must remain in a state of rudeness, utterly incompatible with all manner of delicacy. And as his senses are divided on this point, his touch and his taste must be extremely coarse and blunt, his sight, his hearing, and his smelling equally subtle, such as the animal state in general, and accordingly, if we may believe travelers, it is that of the most savage nations. We must not therefore be surprised that the Hottentots of the Cape of Good Hope distinguish with their naked eyes ship on the ocean, at as great a distance as the Dutch can discern them with their glasses, nor that the savages of America should have tracked the Spaniards with their smell to as great a degree of exactness as the best dogs could have done, nor those nor that all these barbarous nations support nakedness without pain, use such large quantities of pimento to give their food a relish, and drink like water the strongest liquors of Europe. That's Rousseau's words, not mine. I do not agree with his calling Native Americans barbarous and so forth. Let's keep going. As yet, I have considered man merely in his physical capacity. Let us now endeavor to examine him in a metaphysical and moral light. I can discover nothing in any animal but an ingenious machine, to which nature has given senses to wind itself up and guard, to a certain degree, against everything that might destroy or disorder it. I perceive the very same things in a human machine, with this difference, that nature alone operates in all the operations of the beast, whereas man, as a free agent, has a share in his. One chooses by instinct, the other by an act of liberty, for which reason the beast cannot deviate from the rules that have been prescribed to it, even in cases where such deviation might be useful, and man often deviates from the rules laid down for him to his prejudice. Thus, a pigeon would starve near a dish of the best meat, and a cat on a heap of fruit or corn, though both might very well support life with the food with which they thus disdain, did they but bethink themselves to make a trial of it. Fuck that sense. It is in this manner that dissolute men run into excesses, which bring on fevers and death itself, because the mind depraves the senses, and when nature ceases to speak, the will still continues to dictate. All animals have ideas. Since all animals have senses, they even combine their ideas to a certain degree, and in this respect, it is only the difference of such degree that constitutes the difference between man and beast. Some philosophers have even advanced that there is a greater difference between some men and some others than some men and others beasts, and it is not therefore so much the understanding that constitutes among animals the specific distinction of men as his quality of a free agent. Nature speaks to all animals, and beasts obey her voice. Man feels the same impulse, but he at the same time perceives that he is free to resist or to acquiesce, and it is in the consciousness of this liberty that the spirituality of this soul chiefly appears. For natural philosophy explains, in some measure, the mechanism of the senses and the formation of ideas. But in the power of willing, or rather of choosing, and in the consciousness of this power, nothing can be discovered but acts that are purely spiritual and cannot be accounted for by the laws of mechanics. But even if the difficulties in which all these questions are involved should leave some room to dispute on this difference between man and beast, there is another very specific quality that distinguishes them, and a quality which will admit of no dispute. This is the faculty of improvement. A faculty which, as circumstances offer, successively unfolds all the other faculties, and resides among us, not only in the species, but also in the individuals that compose it, whereas a beast is, at the end of some months, all he ever will be during the rest of his life, and a species, at the end of 1,000 years, precisely what it was the first year of that 1,000. Why is man alone subject to dotage? Is it not because he thus returns to his primitive condition, and because, while the beast, which has acquired nothing and has likewise nothing to lose, continues always in possession of his instinct, man, losing by old age or by accident all the acquisitions he had made in consequence of his perfectibility, thus falls back even lower than beasts themselves. It would be a melancholy necessity for us to be obliged to allow that this distinctive and almost unlimited faculty is the source of all man's misfortunes. It is that it is this faculty which, through slow degrees, draws him out of his original condition, in which his days would slide away insensibly in peace and in innocence. That it is this faculty which, in a succession of ages, produces his discoveries and mistakes, his virtues and his vices, and in the long run renders him both his own and nature's tyrant. Oh, fuck. It would be shocking to be obliged to to commend, as a beneficent being, whoever he was that first suggested to the Orinoco Indians the use of these boards, which they bind on the temples of their children, and which secure to them the enjoyment of some part at least of their natural imbecility and happiness. What? Okay. Savage man, abandoned by nature the pure instinct, or rather indemnified for the instinct which has perhaps been denied to him by faculties capable of immediately supplying its place, and of raising him afterwards a great deal higher, would therefore begin with purely animal functions. To see and to feel would be his first condition, which he would enjoy in common with the other animals. To will and not to will, to wish and to fear, would be the first, in the manner the only operations of his soul, until new circumstances occasion new developments. Oh my God. Let moralists say what they will. The human understanding is greatly indebted to the passions, which, on their side, are likewise universally allowed to be greatly indebted to the human understanding. It is by the activity of our passions that our reason improves. We covet knowledge merely because we covet enjoyment, and it is impossible to conceive why a man exempt from fears and desires shall take the trouble to reason. The passions, in the turn, owe their origins to our needs, and their increase to our progress in science, for we cannot desire or fear anything, but in consequence of the ideas we have for it, or of the simple impulses of nature, and of savage man, destitute of every species of knowledge. Wait, I just lost it. Okay, start from the sentence. The passions, in their turn, owe their origin to our needs, and their increase to our progress in science, for we cannot desire or fear anything, but in consequence of the ideas we have for it, or of the simple impulses of nature, and the savage man, destitute of every species of knowledge, experiences no passions but those of this last kind, the last kind being the simple impulses of nature. His desires never extend beyond his physical wants. He knows no goods but food, a female, and rest. He fears no evils but pain and hunger. I say pain and not death, for no animal, merely as such, will ever know what it is to die, and the knowledge of death and of its terrors is one of the first acquisitions made by man in consequence of his deviating from the animal state. I could easily, were it necessary, cite facts in support of this opinion, and show that the progress of the mind has everywhere kept pace exactly with the wants to which nature has left the inhabitants exposed, or to which the circumstances had subjected them, and consequently to the passions which inclined them to provide for these wants. I could exhibit in Egypt the arts starting up and extending themselves from the inundations of the Nile. I could pursue them in their progress among the Greeks, where they were seen to bud, grow, and rise to the heavens, in the midst of the sands and rocks of Attica, without being able to take root on the fertile banks of the Europus. I would observe that, in general, the inhabitants of the north are more industrious than those of the south, because they can less do without industry. As if nature thus meant to make all things equal by giving to the mind the fertility she has denied to the soil. But leaving aside the uncertain testimony of history, which does not perceive that everything seems to remove from savage man the temptation and the means of altering his condition. But leaving aside the uncertain testimony of history, who does not perceive that everything seems to remove from savage man the temptation and the means of altering his condition? His imagination pains nothing to him, his heart asks nothing of him. His moderate wants are so easily supplied with what he has everywhere find wants are so easily supplied with what he everywhere finds ready to his hand, and he stands at such a distance from the degree of knowledge requisite to cover it more, that he can distance from the degree of knowledge that he can neither have foresight nor curiosity. The spectacle of nature, by growing quite familiar to him, becomes at least equally different. God, I need water. It is constantly the same order, constantly the same revolutions. He has not sense enough to feel surprised at the sight of the greatest wonders, and it is not in his mind we must look for that philosophy, which man must have to know how to observe once what he has every day seen. His soul, which nothing disturbs, gives itself up entirely to the consciousness of its present existence, without any thought of even the nearest futurity, and his projects, equally confined with his views, scarce extend to the end of the day. Such is, even at present, the degree of foresight in the Caribbean. He sells his cotton bed in the morning and comes in the evening with tears in his eyes to buy it back, not having foreseen that he should want it again the next night. The more we meditate on the subject, the wider does the distance between mere sensation and the most simple knowledge become in our eyes, and it is impossible to conceive how man, by his own powers alone, without the assistance of communication and the spur of necessity, could have got over such great an interval. How many ages perhaps revolved before man beheld any other fire but that of the heavens? How many different accidents must have concurred to make them acquainted with the most common uses of this element? How often have they let it go out before they knew the art of reproducing it? And how often, perhaps, has not every one of these secrets perished with the discoverer? What shall we say of agriculture, art which requires so much labor and foresight, which depends upon other arts, which, it is very evident, can be practiced only in a society which had at least begun, and in which does not so much serve as to draw from the earth, and which does not so much serve to draw from the earth food which it would yield them without all that much trouble, as to oblige her to produce these things which are preferable to our taste. But let us suppose that men had multiplied to such a degree that the natural products of the earth no longer sufficed for their support, a supposition which, by the way, would prove that this kind of life would be very advantageous to the human species. Let us suppose that, without forge or workshops, the instruments of husbandry had dropped from the heavens into the hands of savages, that these men had overcome that mortal aversion that they all have for constant labor, that they had learned to foretell their wants at so great a distance of time, that they had guessed exactly how they were to break the earth, sow the grain, and plant trees, that they had at least found out the art of grinding their corn, and improving by fermentation the juice of their grapes, all operations which must have been taught them by the gods, since we cannot conceive how they should make such discoveries of themselves. After all these fine presents, what man would be mad enough to cultivate a field that may be robbed by the first comer, man or beast, who takes a fancy to the produce of it? And would any man consent to spend his days in labor and fatigue, when the rewards of his labor and fatigue become more and more precarious in proportion of his want to them? In a word, how could this situation engage men to cultivate the earth as long as it was not parceled out among them, that is, as long as the state of nature subsisted? Though we should suppose savage man as well versed in the art of thinking as philosophers make him, though we were, following them, to make him a philosopher himself, discovering by himself the sublimest truths, forming to himself by the most abstract arguments, maxims of justice and reason drawn from the love of order in general, or from the known rule of his creator. In a word, though we were to suppose his mind as intelligent and enlightened as it would have had to be, and is in fact found to have been dull and stupid, what benefit would the species receive from all these metaphysical discoveries, which could not be communicated but must perish with the individual who had made them? What progress could mankind make in the forest, scattered up and down among the other animals? And to what degree could men mutually improve and enlighten each other when they had no fixed habitation nor any need of each other's assistance? When the same persons scarcely met twice in their whole lives, and on meeting neither spoke to or so much as knew about each other? Let us consider how many ideas we owe to the use of speech, how much grammar exercises and facilitates the operations of the mind. Let us, besides, reflect on the immense pains and time that the first invention of languages must have required. Let us add these reflections to the precedings, and then we may judge how many thousand ages must have been requisite to develop successively the operations which the human mind is capable of producing. I must now beg leave to stop one moment to consider the perplexities attending the origin of languages. Please don't. I might here barely cite or repeat the researches made in relation to the question by the Abbé de Contillac, which all further confirm my system, and perhaps even suggested to me the first idea of it. But as the first matter in which the philosopher resolves the difficulties he himself raises concerning the origins of arbitrary signs, oh my god, this fucking sentence. But as the matter in which this philosopher resolves the difficulties he himself raises concerning the origin of arbitrary signs shows that he supposes, what I doubt, namely a kind of society already established among the inventors of languages, I think it my duty at the same time that I refer to his reflections to give his I think it my duty at the same time that I refer to his reflections to give my own, in order to expose the same difficulties in a light suitable to my subject. The first that offers itself is how languages can become necessary. For as there was no correspondence between men, nor the least necessity for any, there is no conceiving the necessity of this invention, or the possibility of it, for it was not indispensable. I might say with many others that languages are the fruit of the domestic intercourse between fathers, mothers, and children. But this, besides its not answering the difficulties, would be committing the same error as those who, reasoning on the state of nature, transfer it to it ideas gathered in society, always consider families as living together under one roof, and their members as observing among themselves a union, especially intimate and permanent as that which exists among us, where so many common interests unite them, whereas in this primitive state, as there were neither houses nor cabins, nor any kind of property, everyone took up his lodging at random, and seldom continued above one night at the same place. Males and females united without any premeditated design, as chance, occasion, or desire brought them together. Nor had they any great occasion for language to make known what they had to say to each other. They parted with the same ease. The mother suckled her children when just born for her own sake, but afterwards, when habit had made them dear to her, for their sake. But they no longer soon gained strength enough to run about in quest of food than they separated even from her, and as they scarcely had in any other method of not losing each other than that of remaining constantly in each other's sight, they soon came to a point of not even recognizing each other when they happened to meet again. I need water. Fucking need water, man. Let's keep going. I must further observe that the child, having always wants to explain, and consequently more things to say to his mother than the mother can have say to him, it is he that must be at the chief expense of invention, and the language he makes use of must be in a great measure of his own work. This makes the number of languages equal to that of the individuals who are to speak them, and this multiplicity of languages is further increased by their roving and vagabond kind of life, which allows no idiom time enough to acquire any consistency. For to say that a mother would have dictated to the child the words that he must employ to ask her this thing and that may well enough explain in what manner languages already formed are taught, but it does not show us in what manner they are first formed. Let us suppose this first difficulty conquered. Let us for a moment consider ourselves on the side of the immense space which must have separated the pure state of nature from that in which languages become necessary. And let us, after allowing their necessity, examine how languages could begin to be established. A new difficulty this, still more stubborn than the preceding. For if men stood in need of speech to learn to think, they must have stood in still greater need the art of thinking to invent that of speaking. And though we could conceive how the sounds of the voice came to be taken for the conventional interpreters of our ideas, we should not be nearer knowing who could have been the interpreters of this convention for such ideas, which, in consequence of their not corresponding to any sensible objects, could not be indicated by gesture or voice, so that we can scarcely form any tolerable conjectures concerning the birth of this art of communicating our thoughts and establishing a correspondence between minds, a sublime art, which, though so remote from its origin, philosophers still behold at such a prodigious distance from its perfection, that I never met with one of them bold enough to affirm it would ever arrive there, even though the revolutions necessarily produced by time were suspended in its favor. Though prejudice could be banished from, or would at least consent to sit silent in the presence of our academies, and though these societies should consecrate themselves entirely and during whole ages to the study of this thorny matter. The first language of man, the most universal and most energetic of all languages, in short, the only languages he needed, before there was a necessity of persuading assembled multitudes, was the cry of nature. As this cry was never extorted but by a kind of instinct in the most urgent cases, to implore assistance in great danger, or relief in great sufferings, it was of little use in the common occurrences of life, where more moderate sentiments generally prevail. When the ideas of men began to extend and multiply, and the closer communications began to take place among them, they labored to devise more numerous signs, and a more extensive language. They multiplied the inflections of the voice, and added to them gestures, which are, in their own nature, more expressive, and whose meaning depends less on any prior determination. They therefore expressed visible and movable objects by gestures, and those which strike the ear by imitative sounds. But as gestures scarcely indicate anything except objects that are actually present or can be easily described, and visible actions, as they are not of general use, since darkness or the interposition of a material object renders them useless, and as besides they require attention rather than exercise it, men at length bethought themselves of substituting for them the articulations of voice, which, without having the same relation to any determinate object, are, in quality of conventional signs, fitter to represent all our ideas. A substitution, which could only have been made by common consent, and in a matter pretty difficult to practice by men, whose rude organs were unimproved by exercise. A substitution, which is in itself still more difficult to be conceived, since such a common agreement would have required a motive, and speech therefore appears to have been exceedingly requisite to establish the use of speech. This is literal torture. We must suppose that the words first made use of by men had in their minds a much more extensive signification than those employed in languages of some standing, and that, considering how ignorant they were of the division of speech into its constituent parts, they at least gave each word the meaning of an entire proposition. When afterwards they began to perceive the difference between the subject and attribute, and between word and noun, a distinction which required no mean effort of genius, the substances of a time were only so many proper names. The infinitive was the only tense, and as to adjectives, great difficulties must have attended the development of the idea that represents them, since every adjective is an abstract word, and abstraction is a very unnatural and very painful operation. At first, they gave each object a particular name, without any regard to its genus or species, things which these first originators of language were in no condition to distinguish, and every individual presented itself in isolation of their minds, as they are in the picture of nature. If they called one oak A, they called another oak B, so that their dictionary must have been more extensive in proposition as their knowledge of things was more confined. It could not but be a very difficult task to get rid of so diffuse and embarrassing a nomenclature, as in order to marshal the several beings under common and generic denominations, it was necessary to be first acquainted with their properties and their differences, to be stocked with observations and definitions, that is to say, to understand natural history and metaphysics, advantages which the men of these times could not have enjoyed. Get me out of here, please. I don't want to do this anymore. Besides, general ideas cannot be conveyed to the mind without the assistance of words, nor can the understanding seize them except by means of propositions. This is one of the reasons why mere animals cannot form such ideas, nor ever acquire the perfectibility which depends on such an operation. When a monkey leaves without the least hesitation one nut for another, are we to think that he has any general ideas of that kind of fruit, and that he compares its archetype with these two individual bodies? No, certainly. But the sight of one of these nuts calls back to his memory the sensations which he has received from the other, and his eyes, modified after some certain manner, give notice to his palate of the modification it is, in its turn, going to receive. Every general idea is purely intellectual. Let the imagination tamper ever so little with it, it immediately becomes a particular idea. Endeavor to represent to yourself the image of a tree in general. You never will be able to do it. In spite of all your efforts, it will appear big or little, with thin or thick foliage, light or dark, and were you able to see nothing in it but what can be seen in every tree, such a picture would no longer resemble any tree. Beings perfectly abstract are perceivable in the same manner, or are only conceivable by the assistance of speech. The definition of a triangle can alone give you a just idea of the figure. The moment you go from a triangle in your mind, it is this or that particular triangle and no other, and you cannot avoid giving breadth to its lines and color to its area. We must therefore make use of propositions. We must therefore speak to have general ideas. For the moment the imagination stops, the mind can continue to function only with the aid of discourse. If therefore the first inventors could give no names to any ideas but those they had already, it follows that the first substances could never have been anything more than proper names. We have 10 more pages to go. And I am suffering. I'm suffering. But when by means which I cannot conceive, our new grammarians begin to extend their ideas and generalize their words, the ignorance of the inventors must have confined this method to very narrow bounds, and as being acquainted with the distinctions called genus and species, they afterwards made too few genera and species for want of having considered beings in all their differences. To push the divisions far enough, they must have had more knowledge and experience than we can allow them, and have made more researches and taken more pains than we can suppose them willing to submit to. Now if, even at this present time, we every day discover new species, which had before escaped all our observations, how many species must have escaped the notice of men, who judged of things merely from their first appearances? As to the primitive classes and the most general notions, it were superfluous to add that these they must have likewise overlooked. How, for example, could they have thought of or understood the words matter, spirit, substance, mode, figure, motion, since even our philosophers, who for so long a time have been constantly employing these terms, can themselves scarcely understand them, and since the ideas annexed to these words being purely metaphysical, they could find no models of them in nature. I stop at these first advances and beseech my judges to suspend their reading a little in order to consider what great way language has still to go in regard to the invention of physical substances alone, though the easiest part of language to invent, to be able to express all these sentiments of man, to assume an invariable form, to bear being spoken in public, and to influence society. I earnestly entreat them to consider how much time and knowledge must have been requisite to find out numbers, abstract words, the aorists, and all the other tenses of verbs, the particles and syntax, the method of connecting propositions of arguments, of forming all the logic of discourse. For my own part, I am frightened by the difficulties that multiply at every step, and so convinced of the almost demonstrated impossibility of languages owing their birth and establishment to means that were merely human, that I must leave to whoever may please to take it up, the task of discussing this difficult problem. Which was the more necessary, society already formed to invent languages, or languages already invented to form society? Whatever these origins may have had, we may at least infer from the little care which nature has taken to bring men together by mutual wants, and make the use of speech easy to them, how little she has done towards making them sociable, and how little she has contributed to anything which they themselves had done to become so. In fact, it is impossible to conceive why, in this primitive state, one man should have more occasion for the assistance of another than one monkey or one wolf for that of another animal of the same species, or supposing that he had, what motive could induce another to assist him, or even if he did so, how he, who wanted assistance, and he from whom it was wanted, could agree upon the conditions. I know we are continually told that in this state man would have been the most wretched of all creatures, and if it is true, I fancy I have proved it, that he must have continued many ages without either the desire or the opportunity of emerging from such a state. The assertion could only serve to justify a charge against nature, and not any against the being which nature has thus constituted. But if I thoroughly understand this term wretched, it is a word that either has no meaning or signifies nothing but a privation attended with pain, and a suffering state of body or soul. Now I would fain know what kind of misery can be that of a free being, whose heart enjoys perfect peace, and body perfect health, and which is most likely to become insupportable to those who enjoy a civil or a natural life. In civil life, we can scarcely meet a single person who does not complain of his existence. Many even throw away as much of it as they can, and the united force of divine and human laws can hardly put a stop to this disorder. Was ever any free savage known to have been so much tempted to complain of life and to do away with himself? Let us therefore judge with less pride on which side real misery is to be placed. Nothing, on the contrary, would have been so unhappy as savage man, dazzled by flashes of knowledge, racked by passions, and reasoning about a state different from that in which he saw himself placed. It was in consequence of a very wise providence that the faculties, of which he potentially enjoyed, were not to develop to themselves, except in proportion as there offered occasions to exercise them, lest they should be superfluous or troublesome to him when he did not yet want them, or tardy or useless when he did. He had, in his instinct alone, everything requisite to live in the state of nature. In his cultivated reason, he has barely what is necessary to live in a state of society. It appears at first sight that as there are no kind of moral relations between men and the state, nor any known duties, they cannot be either good or bad, and hide neither vices nor virtues, unless we take these words in the physical sense, and call vices in the individual the qualities which may prove detrimental to his own preservation, and virtues, those which may contribute to it, in which case we should be obliged to consider him as most virtuous, who made least resistance against the most simple impulses of nature. But without deviating from the usual meaning of these terms, it is proper to suspend the judgment we may form of such a situation, and be on our guard against prejudice, until, balance in hand, we have examined whether there are more virtues or vices among civilized men, or whether these virtues do more good than their vices do them harm, or whether the improvement of their understanding is sufficient compensation for the mischief they do to each other, in proportion as they become better informed of the good they ought to do, or whether, on the whole, they would not be much happier in a condition where they had nothing to fear or to hope from each other, due to have submitted to universal dependence, and to have obliged themselves to depend for everything upon those which who do not think of themselves obliged to give them meaning. But above all things, let us beware of concluding with Hobbes that man, as having no idea of goodness, must be naturally bad. Oh, but above all things, let us beware of concluding with Hobbes that man, as having no idea of goodness, must be naturally bad, that he is vicious because he does not know what virtue is, that he always refuses to do any service to those of his own species, because he believes that nothing is due to them, that in virtue of that right which he justly claims to everything he wants, he foolishly looks upon himself as proprietor of the whole universe. Hobbes very plainly saw the flaws in all the modern definitions of natural right, but the consequences, which he draws from his own definition, show that the sense in which he understands it is equally false. This author, to argue from his own principle, should say that the state of nature, being that in which the care of our own preservation interferes least with the preservation of others, was consequently the most favorable to peace, and the most suitable to mankind, whereas he advances the very reverse in consequence of his having injudiciously included in that care which savage man takes of his preservation, the satisfaction of numberless passions which are the work of society and have made laws necessary. A bad man, says he, is a robust child. But this is not proving that savage man is a robust child, and though we were to grant that he was, what could this philosopher infer from such a concession? That is, this man, when robust, depended on others as much as when feeble, there is no excess that he would not be guilty of. He would make nothing of striking his mother when she delayed ever so little to give him the breast. He would claw and bite and strangle without remorse the first of his younger brothers, that ever so accidentally jostled or otherwise disturbed him. But these are two contradictory suppositions in the state of nature, to be robust and dependent. Man is weak when dependent, and his own master before he grows robust. Hobbes did not consider that the same cause which hinders savages from making use of their reason, as our jurisconsults pretend, hinders them at the same time from making an ill use of their faculties, as he himself pretends, so that we may say that the savages are not bad, precisely that because they don't know what it is to be good. For it is neither the development of the understanding nor the curb of the law, but the calmness of their passions and their ignorance of vice that hinder them from doing ill. Tanto plus in illis proficit vitiorum ignoratio, quam in his cognitio virtutis, or that means, so much more does ignorance of vice profit those than knowledge of virtue the others. There is besides another principle that has escaped Hobbes, and which, having been given to man to moderate, on certain occasions, the ferocity of self-love, or the desire of self-preservation previous to the appearance of that love, temptates the ardor let me just read that sentence again. There is besides another principle that has escaped Hobbes, and which, having been given to man to moderate, on certain occasions, the ferocity of self-love, or the desire of self-preservation previous to the appearance of that love, tempts the ardor with which he naturally pursues his private welfare, by an innate abhorrence to see beings suffer that resemble him. I shall not surely be contradicted in granting the man the only natural virtue, which is the most passionate detractor of human virtues, could not, which the most, I shall not surely be contradicted in granting to man the only natural virtue, which the most passionate detractor of human virtues could not deny him. I mean that of pity, a disposition suitable to creatures weak as we are, and liable to so many evils, a virtue so much the more universal, and withal useful to man, as it takes place in him before all manner of reflection, and withal useful to man, as it takes place in him before all manner of reflection, and so natural that the beasts themselves sometimes give evident signs of it. Not to speak of the tenderness of mothers from the young, and of the dangers they face to screen them from danger. With what reluctance are horses known to trample upon living bodies. One animal never passes unmoved by the dead carcass of another animal of the same species. There are even some who bestow a kind of sepulture upon their dead fellows, and the morning lowings of cattle, on their entering the slaughter-house, publish the impression made upon them by the horrible spectacle that they are struck with. It is with pleasure we see the author of the Fable of the Bees forced to acknowledge man a compassionate and sensitive being, and lay aside, in the example he offers to confirm it, his cold and subtle style, to place before us the pathetic picture of a man who, with his hands tied up, is obliged to behold a beast of prey tear a child from the arm of his mother, and then with his teeth grind the tender limbs, and with his claws rend the throbbing entrails of his innocent victim. What horrible emotions must not such a spectator experience at the sight of an event which does not personally concern him? What anguish must he not suffer at his not being able to assist the fainting mother or the expiring infant? Damn. Such is the pure impulse of nature, anterior to all manner of reflection. Such is the force of natural pity, which the most dissolute matters have as yet found it so difficult to extinguish, since we every day see, in our theatrical representations, those men sympathize with the unfortunate and weep at their sufferings, who, if in this tyrant's place, would aggravate the torments of their enemies. Mandeville was aware that men, in spite of all their morality, would never have been better than monsters, if nature had not given them pity to assist reason. But he did not perceive that men from this quality alone flow all the social virtues which he would dispute mankind the possession of. In fact, what is generosity, what clemency, what humanity, but pity applied to the weak, to the guilty, or to the human species in general? Even benevolence and friendship, if we judge right, will appear the effects of a constant pity, fixed upon a particular object, for to which that a person may not suffer. What is it but to wish? For to wish that a person may not suffer, what is it but to wish that he may be happy? Though it may be true that commiseration is no more than a sentiment which puts us in the place of him who suffers, a sentiment obscure but active in the savage, developed but dormant in civilized man, how could this notion affect the truth of what I advance but to make it more evident? In fact, commiseration must be so much the more energetic, the more intimately the animal that beholds any kind of distress identifies with the animal that labors under it. Now, it is evident that this identification must have been infinitely more perfect in the state of nature than in the state of reason. It is the reason that engenders self-love, and reflection that strengthens it. It is reason that makes man shrink into himself. It is reason that makes him keep aloof from everything that can trouble or afflict him. It is philosophy that destroys his connections with other men. That's why I'm a philosopher. It is in consequence of her dictates, for aught I care. It is in consequence of her dictates that he mutters for himself at the sight of another in distress. You may perish for all I care. I am safe. Nothing less than these evils, which threaten the whole community, can disturb the calm sleep of the philosopher and force him from his bed. One man may, with impunity, murder another under his windows. He has nothing to do with but clap his hands to his ears, argue a little with himself to hinder nature, that startles within him, from identifying him with the unhappy sufferer. Savage man lacks this admirable talent, and for want of wisdom and reason, is always ready foolishly to obey the first whispers of humanity. In riots and street brawls, the populace flock together, but the prudent man sneaks off. It is the dregs of the people, the market women, that part the combatants, and hinder gentlefolks from cutting one another's throats. It is therefore certain that pity is a natural sentiment, which, by moderating on every individual the activity of self-love, contributes to the mutual preservation of the whole species. It is this pity which hurries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see in distress. It is this pity which, in the state of nature, takes the place of laws, manners, virtue, and with this advantage, that no one is tempted to disobey her gentle voice. It is this pity which will always hinder a robust savage from plundering a feeble child, or infirm old man, of the subsistence they have acquired with pain and difficulty, if he has but the least prospect of providing for himself by any other means. It is this pity which, instead of that sublime maxim of rational justice, do to others as you would have others do to you, inspires all men with that other maxim of natural goodness, a great deal less perfect, but perhaps more useful. Do good to yourself with as little prejudice as you can do to others. It is, in a word, this natural sentiment, rather than in fine-spun arguments, that we must look for the cause of that reluctance which every man would experience to do evil, even independently of the maxims of education. Though it may be the peculiar happiness of Socrates and other geniuses of his stamp to reason themselves into virtue, the human species would long ago have ceased to exist, had it depended entirely for its preservation on the reasonings of the individuals that compose it. With passions so tame and so salutary a curb, men, rather wild than wicked, and more attentive to guard against harm than to do any other animals, were not exposed to any dangerous dissensions. As they kept up no manner of intercourse with each other, and were of course strangers to vanity, to respect, to esteem, to contempt, they had no notion of what we call thine and mine, nor any true idea of justice. As they considered any violence they were liable to as an evil that could be easily repaired, and not as an injury that deserved punishment, and as they never so much as dreamed of revenge, unless perhaps mechanically and unpremeditatedly, as a dog who bites the stone that has been thrown at him, their disputes could seldom be attended with bloodshed, were they never occasioned by a more considerable stake than that of substance. But there is a more dangerous subject of contention, which I must not leave unnoticed. Among the passions which ruffle the heart of men, there is one of a hot and impetuous nature, which renders the sexes necessary to each other, a terrible passion which despises all dangers, bears down all obstacles, and which in its transport seems proper to destroy the human species which it is destined to preserve. What must become of men abandoned to this lawless and brutal rage, without modesty, without shame, and every day disputing the objects of their passion at the expense of their blood? We must in the first place allow that the more violent the passions, the more necessary are laws to restrain them. But beside that, the disorders and the crimes to which these passions daily give rise among us, sufficiently prove the insufficiency of laws for that purpose. We would do well to look back a little further and examine if these evils did not spring up with the laws themselves. For at this rate, even if the laws were capable of repressing these evils, it is the least that might be expected from them that they should check a mischief which would not exist without them. Let us begin by distinguishing between what is moral and what is physical in the passion called love. The physical part of it is that general desire which prompts the sexes to unite with each other. The moral part is that which determines this desire and fixes upon it a particular object to the exclusion of all others, or at least gives it a greater degree of energy for this preferred object. Now it is easy to perceive that the moral part of love is a factitious sentiment engendered by society and cried up by the woman with great care and address in order to establish their empire and secure command to that sex which ought to obey. This sentiment being founded on certain notions of beauty and merit which savage is not capable of having, and upon comparisons which he is not capable of making, can scarcely exist in him. For as his mind was never in a condition to form abstract ideas of regularity and proposition, neither is his heart susceptible of sentiments of admiration and love, which even without our perceiving it are produced by our application of these ideas. He listens solely to the dispositions implanted in him by nature, and not the taste which he never could have acquired. And any woman answers his purpose. 4 pages. Confined entirely to what is physical in love, and happy enough not to know these preferences which sharpen the appetite for it, at the same time that they increase the difficulty of satisfying each such, at the same time that they increase the difficulty of sacrificing such appetite, men, in a state of nature, must be subject to fewer and less violent fits of that passion, and of course there must be fewer and less violent disputes among them in consequence of it. The imagination, which causes so many ravages among us, never speaks to the heart of savages, who peacefully wait for the impulses of nature, yield to these impulses without choice and with more pleasure than fury, and the need once satisfied, all desire is lost. Nothing therefore can be more evident than that it is society alone which has added even to love itself as well as to all the other passions, that impetuous ardor which so often renders it fatal to mankind. And it is so much the more ridiculous to represent savages constantly murdering each other to glut their brutality, as his opinion is diametrically opposite to experience, and the Caribbeans, the people in the world who have as yet deviated least from the state of nature, are to all intents and purposes the most peaceful in their amours, and the least subject to jealousy, though they live in a burning climate which seems always to add considerably to the activity of these passions. As to the inductions which may be drawn in respect to several species of animals, from the battles of the males, who in all seasons cover our poultry yards with blood, and in spring particularly cause our forests to ring again with the noise they make in disputing on their females, we must begin by excluding all these species where nature has evidently established in the relative power of the sexes relations different from those which exist among us. Thus, from the battles of penises, we can form no induction that will affect the human species. In the species where the proportion is better observed, these battles must be owing entirely to the fewness of the females compared with the males, or what amounts to the same, to the intervals of refusal during which the female constantly refuses the advance of the males. For if the female admits the male but 2 months in a year, it is all the same as if the number of females were 5/6 less. Now, neither of these cases is applicable to the human species, where the number of females generally surpasses that of males, and where it has never been observed that, even among savages, the females had, like those of other animals, their stated times of heat and indifference. Besides, among several of these animals, the whole species takes fire all at once, and for some days nothing is to be seen among them but confusion, tumult, disorder, and bloodshed. A state unknown to the human species, where love is never periodical. We cannot therefore conclude from the battles of certain animals for the possession of their females, that the same would be the case of man in a state of nature. And even if we did, since these contests do not destroy the other species, there is at least equal room to think that they would not be fatal to ours, and it is very probable that they would have caused fewer ravages than they do in society, especially in these countries where, morality being as yet held in some esteem, the jealousy of lovers and their vengeance of husbands every day produces duels, murders, and even worse crimes, where the duty of an eternal fidelity serves only to propagate adultery, and the very laws of continence and honor necessarily increase dissoluteness and multiply abortions. Let us conclude that savage man, wandering about in the forest, without industry, without speech, without any fixed residence, and an equal stranger to war and every social tie, without any need of his fellows, as well without any desire of hurting them, and perhaps without ever distinguishing them individually one from the other, subject to few passions, and finding himself all he wants, let us, I say, conclude that savage man had no knowledge or feelings but such as were proper to that situation, that he felt only his real necessities, took notice of nothing but what was his own interest to see, and that his understanding made as little progress as his vanity. If he happened to make any discovery, he could the less communicate it, as he did not even know his children. The art perished with the inventor. There is neither education nor improvement. Generations succeeded generations to no benefit, and is all constantly set up from the same point. Whole centuries rolled on in the rudeness and barbarity of the first age. The race was grown old, and man still remained a child. If I have enlarged so much upon the supposition of this primitive condition, it is because I thought it my duty, considering what ancient errors and inveterate prejudices I have yet to extirpate, to dig to the very roots and show in a true picture of the state of nature, how much even natural inequality falls short in the state of that reality and influence which our writers ascribe to it. In fact, we may easily perceive that among the differences which distinguish men, several pass for natural, which are merely the work of habit and the different kinds of life adopted by men living in a social way. Thus, a robust or delicate constitution and the strength or weakness which depend on it often are produced by the hardy and effeminate manner in which a man has been brought up, than by the primitive constitution of his body. It is the same thus in regards to the forces of mind. And education not only produces a difference between these minds which are cultivated and those which are not, but even increases the difference which is found among the former in proportion to their culture. For let a giant and a dwarf set out on the same road. The giant will every step acquire a new advantage over the dwarf. Now, if we compare the prodigious variety in the education and way of living of the various orders of men in a civil state, with the simplicity and uniformity that prevail in the animal and savage life, where all the individuals feed on the same food, live in the same manner, and do exactly the same things, we shall easily conceive how much the difference between man and man in the state of nature must be less than in the state of society, and every great social inequality must increase the natural inequalities of mankind. But even if nature, in the distribution of her gifts, should really affect all the preferences that are imputed to her, what advantage could the most favored derive from their partiality to the prejudice of others in the state of things that which admits hardly any kind of relation between them? Of what service can beauty be where there is no love? What will wit avail people who do not speak, or cunning those who have no business? Authors are constantly crying out that the strongest would oppress the weakest, but let them explain what they mean by the word oppression. One man will rule with violence, another will groan under a constant subjection to all his caprices. This is precisely what I observe among us, but I don't see how it could be said of savage men, into whose heads it would be a hard matter to drive even the meaning of the words domination and servitude. One man might indeed seize the fruits which another has gathered, the game which another has killed, the cavern which another has occupied for shelter. But how is it possible he should ever exact obedience from him? And what chains of dependence can there be among men who possess nothing? If I am driven from one tree, I have nothing to do but look out for another. If one place is made uneasy for me, what can hinder me from taking up my quarters elsewhere? But suppose I should meet a man so much superior to me in strength, and withal so depraved, so lazy, and so barbarous as to oblige me to provide for his subsistence while he remains idle. He must resolve not to take his eyes from me a single moment, to bind me fast before he can take the least nap, lest I should kill him or give him the slip during his sleep. That is to say, he must expose himself voluntarily to much greater troubles than what he seeks to avoid, than he gives me. And after all this, let him abate ever so little of his vigilance. Let him at some sudden noise but turn his head another way. I am already buried in the forest, my feathers are broken, and he never sees me again. Without insisting any longer upon these details, everyone must see that, as the bonds of servitude are formed merely by the mutual dependence of men upon one another, and the reciprocal necessities which unite them, it is impossible for one man to enslave another, without having first reduced him to a condition which, as it does not exist in the state of nature, must leave every man to his own master, and render the law of the strongest altogether vain and useless. Having proved that inequality in the state of nature is scarcely felt, and that it has very little influence, I must now proceed to show its origin and trace its progress in the successive developments of the human mind. After having shown that perfectibility, the social virtues, and the other faculties which natural man has received as potentialities could never be developed of themselves, that they needed the fortuitous concurrence of several foreign causes which might never arise, and without which he must have eternally remained in his primitive condition, I must proceed to consider and bring together the different accidents which may have perfected the human understanding while debasing the species, and made man wicked by making him sociable, and from so remote a time bring man at last and the world to the point at which we now see them. I must own that, as the events I am about to describe might have happened in many different ways, I can determine my choice only by mere conjecture. But aside from the fact that these conjectures become reasons, when they are the most probable that can be drawn from the nature of things, and the only means we can have of discovering truth, the consequences I mean to deduce from mine will not be merely conjectural, since, on the principles I have just established, it is impossible to form any other system that would not supply me with the same results, and from which I might not draw the same conclusions. This will make it unnecessary for me to dwell on the matter in which the lapse of time compensates for the slight probability of events, on the surprising power of very trivial causes when their action is constant, on the impossibility, on the one hand, of destroying certain hypotheses, while on the other we cannot give them the degree of certainty of facts, on its being the business of history, when two facts are proposed as real and connected by a chain of intermediate facts which are either unknown or considered as such, to furnish such facts as may actually connect them, and the business of philosophy, when history is silent, to point out similar facts which may answer the same purpose. Finally, on the power of similarity in regard to events, to reduce facts to a much smaller number of different classes than is generally imagined. It suffices me to offer these matters to the consideration of my judges. It suffices me to have conducted my inquiry in such a manner as to save the general reader the trouble of considering them at all. I still have to read the second part, but I'll do that without sacrificing my vocal cords. I'll do that on my own time and I'll read them to you later. Alright? I gotta drink some water. God.